Entwined is a podcast about how so much of the world around us is wound or twisted together. This podcast strives to bear unexposed or indiscernible connections using historical and anecdotal sources. I am P.S. McKay, and along with Elliot Gladstone, this is Entwined. Before we begin, a few things to discuss. If you like the show, take a moment to rate us really quickly on iTunes. More high rankings allow us more exposure, and more exposure brings you more material. Secondly, head on over to History Goes Bump podcast and download their episode titled Episode 175, The Santa Maria Inn. Our own Elliot Gladstone is interviewed and shares his own paranormal experience while staying there one fateful night. It's a great listen, even though the term freaky pants may have been mentioned one too many times. And finally, if you want to do more than just rate the show, please visit our Patreon page where you can become a member and donate some money to the production that technically makes you a producer for the show. And who wouldn't want that title? We offer several free benefits, such as an extra behind-the-scenes fireside chat between myself and Elliot, and a PDF of the transcripts of the shows as they air. So take a look at patreon.com/entwinedpodcast and look into becoming a member of the team. And stay twined. There is a small cemetery near my neighborhood growing up. It was unobtrusive and even hidden under years and decades of overgrown shrubbery. If you didn't know any better, you would never have known it even existed, even while living in the area for years. It just sank back into the trees, letting nature reclaim it, while the neighborhood grew around it. None of us gave much thought about it growing up. It was New England. You could drive in the country and come across a random family plot that sometimes practically were in the middle of the road. Literally, this small cemetery was in between two houses, hiding behind a small, almost ancient wall of stacked stone. Rumor was these walls were built by slaves. The idea seemed preposterous growing up. These walls were everywhere in the countryside there, and the idea that slaves did this was just far too confounding. Not for people who felt that they were enlightened, growing up in the center of education in a state that held the world's most premier universities. This state fought to free the slaves. The scars of the Civil War were still being felt in far-off places like the South, but not in Massachusetts. But it is easy to forget that Rhode Island and Massachusetts were the epicenter of the slave trade during the early colonial days. Slaves were traded from Africa to the Caribbean. Some of those slaves came to New England along with a large shipment of Caribbean sugar. And New England would manufacture rum and other goods, sending it back to Africa. Wash, rinse, repeat. It wasn't a very efficient cycle. It was estimated to have taken a year to complete in full, but it was enough to begin the industrial growth in the North, the buildings of walls in the country, of whole universities. Brown University's very foundation is covered in the hands of slaves. The point being that in New England, in comparison to the rest of the U.S., things are 400 to 500 years old, twice the age of the country itself. There are layers upon layers of lives and history that sit under the modern-day neighborhoods and cities that litter the modern-day landscape now. Going back to the cemetery, I had heard of it, but the idea of seeking it out never really interested me. I respected the history, and I didn't want to accidentally defile the old tombstones that were haphazardly trying to maintain their vigil over the family that lay there. I knew it was nearby. To be honest, it was no further than 50 feet from the bus stop that I went to every day. And that goes to show how strong the undergrowth became. But as the years have gone by, the neighborhood took the initiative to clean it up. One can now see this family plot from the roadway. In fact, a friend's wife of mine did some research into the family that lay there for so many centuries. One of the more intriguing finds was that records extended for this family as far back as the 11th century. Members of Parliament and gentry, a member knighted by Henry VIII, another twice imprisoned in the Tower of London for treason and twice acquitted, and another who was beheaded for supporting Richard II. More intriguing was the tombstone in the plot of Jonathan Follett. He was a member of the Lexington Alarm on April 19, 1775. He was one of the original Minutemen months before the U.S. Army was created, and served in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War of the United States was an interesting event in world history. And that may be an understatement of the year there. But growing up, it was always taught that America was a bunch of underdogs fighting for a righteous cause. And while being taxed without having representation in Parliament is a fundamental issue that is a problem, it's not exactly enticing literature to the common elementary schooler. Heck, even the general high schooler. It's boring politics. But it was always dressed up that there was a greater cause to make a greater country. And perhaps at that moment that was true, but it can't be understated how much of it was a bunch of petulant, wealthy landowners who felt they were smarter than the system and decided they knew better and had an opportunity. Don't get me wrong, they were brilliant. The coup won. Yet under the most severe circumstances. This was back when warfare was among a more gentleman's activity. That's my opinion. I'm not a historian, but the idea of lining up your armies in neat lines while wearing brightly lit colored coats, just waiting for the next volley, is an insane idea to me. But they waited, were shot and wounded, or avoided a bullet to take their next turn. This was a bunch of scrappy colonialists who had made their homes here for but just a few generations. No formal education among the lot of them, and they were forced to fight against the best, maybe not the largest army, but the best army in the world, and somehow they won. That's the story in the American zeitgeist. By all accounts, the revolution should never have been won because of such a skilled and well-taught adversary. Yet with will and perseverance, the country succeeded and was able to be founded. Make no mistake, that allegory is ground into every American citizen from birth until death. And that breeds a certain mindset. Whether that is what was able to get us through the Industrial Revolution, through World War I and World War II, and through to now, I can't say. An allegory can only be so strong, or an allegory can be all the stronger. I don't know. I do know that Jon Stewart has said many times during the height of the Troubles during the Second Iraqi War was that the Iraqis needed a story. They needed a worthwhile enemy to band together against and regain the country they'd lost. Having an outside state do that for them would not breed a national ideology or an identity. Well, ISIS has then come along, and time will tell. Getting back to the Revolutionary War, Nathaniel Greene was the greatest least successful general the country has ever had. I'll get there in a moment. He was born in the Warwick area of New England in 1742, the great-great-grandson of John Greene, the founding settler of the area. He was born into a family that discouraged, quote, literary sects, unquote. But Nathaniel was bitten by the inquiry bug. He educated himself in math and law. Reverend Ezra Stiles, who would later become the president of Yale University, was a large and powerful influence on Nathaniel's life. This yearning for knowledge allowed him to accept he couldn't know everything at once during the revolutionary unrest, but he organized the local militia, the Minutemen, as known in Massachusetts, because they would be ready for battle within a minute's notice. While he had founded the militia, he took time to acquire many volumes on military tactics and taught himself the art of war in 1774. In December of 1774, he was appointed to the committee to revise the militia laws, and his zeal for fighting the British is what caused him to be excommunicated from the Quaker Church. The Siege of Boston was the turning point for all of the colonies. Well, I suppose there were many turning points, but what was so significant here was that Nathaniel Greene was promoted due to the incident. It was the opening point of the war. New England militiamen prevented the movement on land of British troops in Boston. Now, it's hard to picture this from the outside, but Boston was and still is in many respects a peninsular city. The militia stood guard on all land exits, preventing the British troops from moving to their assigned positions. Eventually, they went by sea to Nova Scotia, evacuating the ever-increasingly hostile city. Greene was promoted from private to Major General of the Rhode Island Army of Observation, formed in response to the Boston siege. He was appointed 5 weeks later to Brigadier of the Continental Army by the Continental Congress on June 22, 1775, and was later assigned to command of the city of Boston on March of 1776. This is the whirlwind part of the Continental Army. Nathaniel Greene went from private in the militia to one of the 4 major generals, where he eventually was stationed in Long Island. The positions were eventually lost even on the Jersey side of the Hudson. Greene would accept fault for the losses, despite saying that in retreat the army should have burnt New York to the ground to prevent the British from using those resources. Well, Congress had overruled him, and New York still stands to this day. Washington never lost faith in the man, Nathaniel Greene. Washington himself would accept responsibility for the loss of New York and allowed Greene to command one of 2 columns in the Battle of Trenton, where he was victorious. While the war was rather fortunate in the North, the South had a very different matter. The colonists lost Savannah, Charleston, and Cornwallis eventually broke through the line in Camden, South Carolina, which opened up the British to control the majority of the South. Congress chose to entrust Washington with the choice of the next Southern general, to which he named Greene. He was appointed all the troops from Delaware to Georgia with extraordinary full powers. This made him second to the commander-in-chief, George Washington, of the entire Continental Army. There was a key decision in the war that was managed in the South as opposed to the North. Greene chose a strategic plan of retreat. You see, the Southern Army was poorly equipped and terribly trained in comparison to the Cornwallis armies he dictated. After a major victory over the British forces in the Battle of Kings Mountain and Cowpens, where Greene split the Southern Army to make Cornwallis do the same, the army decided on a strategic course of retreat. The army was heavily outmanned by the British and definitely outgunned. The only way to truly make a difference at this point was to use the land behind them. while sucking the resources and gunpowder and ammunition from the enemy in battle after battle. You could not engage Cornwallis directly without massive losses, so Greene pronounced a massive retreat to the south of the Dan River. He utilized a small force to cover the army retreat. In a letter to Washington, Greene described the army as cavalry of the 1st and 3rd Regiments and the Legion amounting to 240, a detachment of 280 infantry in the whole, with other forces making about 700 men, which would harass the enemy. Greene was able to do that and able to outrun the British running further south. By the time the British got to the riverbank, all the boats available to cross it had been utilized, and the British were unable to follow for a marked amount of time, allowing Greene to regain his forces and rebuild. This was considered one of the most masterful military tactic achievements of all time. A week later, Greene crossed the river again with his army and flanked Cornwallis's army. Badly beaten and hurt, the British fled to Wilmington, North Carolina, then to Virginia. Greene did not pursue, allowing for his forces to heal. 6 weeks later, 2,600 of his men engaged the British in the Utah Springs, where they were badly beaten, and the British withdrew to Charleston, where Cornwallis stayed. Pinned in the peninsula for the remainder of the war, it's ironic, considering that Greene was technically defeated in almost every major battle in the Southern campaign. After the war, Greene retired in the South, after Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina elected him large amounts of land and money. He would eventually sell some of that land to pay off the bills for rations of his Southern army. He later settled in his Georgia estate and died at the age of 43 in 1786. Greene was a man who had an indelible influence on the North and the South as the young country developed. While he was able to succeed, the old scars of the slave trade could not, as the United States entered the middle of the 19th century. The Civil War erupted in 1861. It has been described as a war of many things, slavery, of course, the biggest provocateur. And that is probably the biggest root of it all, but there are many secondary issues that were associated with it, primarily states' rights. You see, when the country was initially founded, it was based on a confederacy, where the states had a large say in how the government should run. But that was too loose a government and would eventually be replaced by the federation that we currently practice. In my opinion, the South never had a chance. Whether it was about slaves or a way of life, the North, ironically, had made its profits and advancements over slavery 100 years beforehand by using industry during the rum slave trade. This is why the North was able to begin their mills and industry well before the South had a chance. And where there is industry, there is innovation. The railroads, the Iron Horse, won the war for the North by having as many as 4 times the density of networks along their borders as the South. More trains, more supplies, and soldiers were able to be transported. It's interesting to point out that despite the North's vast resources on hand, the war did not start out so favorably. It took a special man to charge the situation in a more unlikely position. Edwin Stanton, it can be said, is probably the least recognized but most powerful figure in American history. His family came from the Massachusetts colony Quakers. He led a life in law, to the point where he actually argued some of his key cases in the Supreme Court that would go on to shape U.S. patent policy, based on a large piece of farm equipment that could harvest large burgeoning wheat fields in the West. His court proceedings even had him cross future President Abraham Lincoln at a time when Stanton was hired to take over for Lincoln, who had not been informed of the client's referral. And it was an interesting meet-cute for what would later transpire between them. He went on to marry Mary Hutchinson, a descendant of Meriwether Lewis, yes, of the Lewis and Clark expeditions that I covered in episode 10 for you longtime entwined listeners. My point in bringing up Edwin Stanton was that he would eventually be brought into President Lincoln's cabinet as Secretary of War to take charge of the North's mishappenstances. The position at the time had very little respect. Under the previous secretary, it had earned the moniker of, quote, the lunatic asylum, end quote. Its authority was largely disregarded, and the North's army generals held the brunt of the operating authority early in the Civil War. Stanton changed that. He repaired relations with Congress by dismissing those in the War Department that were considered to have Confederate sympathies. He appointed John Tucker as an assistant secretary. This is important because Tucker was the CEO of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, a key resource needed in the war. Stanton even gained the ability from Congress to review individuals in Army promotion. While before it was a spoils system based upon whom the administration knew, Stanton got rid of that and focused on merits and quality of records for promotions, inherently strengthening the Army's backbone one promotion at a time. He even strengthened the transportation and communication network across the North by building more telegraph lines. In the waning days of the war, the administration got word that General Lee sued for peace when General Ulysses S. Grant received representatives of Lee. Upon hearing Lincoln's acceptance and order to Grant to attain peace in any manner necessary, Stanton stopped it, advising that the suit for peace would have to be in Lincoln's hands, not Lee's. If not, then the president held little power, and it would be considered a mere figurehead. Lincoln would immediately change his tone and ordered Grant to not accept any form of communication unless it was a complete capitulation of Lee's army. A month later, on the run and back against the wall after Richmond, North Carolina fell to the North, Lee surrendered. 10 days later, Stanton suspended the conscription and recruitment efforts. The war had been won, and the nation would slowly lick its deep wounds for decades to come. That same evening that Stanton had suspended the draft, Lincoln invited him and his family to a night out at the theater the following evening. Stanton declined. He went to bed that night of the show around 10 p.m. He was suddenly awakened to the news that Lincoln and his two guests had been attacked. Stanton immediately went to the house across the street from the theater where Lincoln lay. Upon entering the room where the president lay diagonally on the bed due to his height, William Marvel witnessed a man in charge. Quote, Stanton's emotional detachment and his domineering persona made him valuable that night, as others wallowed in anguish. End quote. Another witness stated, always before, death close at hand had unsettled him close to the point of imbalance. Now he seemed calm, grim, decisive, in complete control of himself. Not much was known of Vice President Andrew Jackson, who would be sworn in at 11 a.m. on April 15th. This left Stanton in a very unique and powerful position. He was in a virtual control of the country, and Congress was not in session. The Army was answering to him by this point, and it was he who took control of the investigation and security of the remainder of the cabinet. At his request, the Secret Service and the NYPD joined the War Department's detectives in the tireless search of Booth and any accomplices. Upon recovery of Booth's body from the shootout As earlier detailed in our episode Quicksilver, Stanton knew he would be lionized by the South, and so Booth was buried in a secret, unmarked, and unhallowed grave upon his orders. All but 3 of the remaining conspirators in the assassination would be hung. I would be remiss without mentioning that Stanton was also involved in the first impeachment in U.S. history. Andrew Johnson and he did not get along, and Johnson, after 2 failed attempts to remove Stanton from the Secretary of War post, was thwarted. The second time, after appointing a new candidate to the post, Stanton outwardly refused to step down. Upon this move, the House made a motion to impeach Johnson, based on party lines saying the removal of Stanton was an illegal one. Now, I'm going to take a moment and say this. No matter how dark it feels given the present-day political climate and rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, it must be known that this partisanship has been around for a very long time in our history. Whether you should take comfort in that is a whole other issue. Now, the impeachment proceeded, and later Johnson was acquitted of all charges, consequently resulting in Stanton stepping down. Stanton did not necessarily fade into the night after this, but his health did in fact impede his ability to continue in public office for the remainder of his years. On December 24th of 1869, Stanton passed away at the age of 55 years old after difficulty breathing and complaints of pains to his head, neck, and spine. President Ulysses S. Grant wanted to throw a state funeral for him, feeling that Stanton had been such an important figure for the country. His wife insisted on the affair to be as simple and private as possible. Nevertheless, Grant ordered all public offices to be closed that day, and putting flags to be flown at half-mast while gun salutes sounded at army installations all around the country. I find it perplexing that a man of Stanton's stature and influence had not been taught to me in my schooling while growing up. He was a key figure behind all the public figures I learned about. Without him, those people that were taught to me may not have been taught at all, or in an extremely different light. Nowadays, you can find the remaining honor to this man that this nation holds for him in the Washington, D.C. area. If you travel along Massachusetts Avenue, intersecting with Maryland Avenue, a moment where the north meets the south in a sense, you will find Stanton Park. It was originally planned in the development of the D.C. area and is known for dog walking in some parts, while it is maintained by the National Park Service. If you were to venture into the center of the park, one will notice a large statue of a Revolutionary general on horseback. Going in for a closer look, that statue happens to be the memorial for Nathaniel Greene, standing watch over the Capitol that he never got to see in real life. While in a park named after a man who was the architect in maintaining the country Greene fought for, and to make sure that it would not perish into the night. Thank you for listening. Entwined is a podcast that releases every other week, and is written, recorded, and produced by P.S. McKay and Elliot Gladstone. This episode was written by P.S. McKay. Please tune in next time to see what Elliot Gladstone has in store for us. For more information about the show and the authors, please check out entwinedpodcast.com, or visit our Twitter page @entwinedpodcast.